Well, last week we were in Exodus chapter 12, and we looked at the story of the Passover when God sent the 10th and final plague upon Egypt, and he sent an angel called the Destroyer, and Egypt lost all their firstborn children. And Israel was spared, and God passed over each of their households. And they were set free from Egypt finally. And so now we find ourselves with Israel on their journey away from Egypt. And we're joining them on the road towards Mount Sinai. And we're going to see kind of the direction that God takes them. And God doesn't take them on a very direct route. God takes Israel many miles through a detour to get where they're going. We're going to talk about that today. And I think for each of us, life can put us on different detours. Like we think we're going one direction, and then life takes us a much different direction to where we're going. It's unanticipated. It's a lot of times unwanted. We'd like to just say, this is what I want for my life, and I'd like for that to happen, and I'd like to get there as soon as possible because we like shortcuts. And then it's like, nope, you're going to go on this long detour to get to where you're going. I've faced this, probably not as much as some of you, because I'm only 25. So my story is probably a lot different than yours, and probably a lot of you have faced many detours throughout your life. But here's a story of one of my detours. And you know, it's actually the story of how I ended up being the pastor here. And it's a pretty interesting story, and I'd like to share it with you. So it takes us back to 2014, actually. In 2014, this church was looking for a new pastor. And that was the first time I had heard of Derby, or the Derby Community Church. And how I heard of it was I was doing an internship in Franklin, Vermont, which, for those of you who don't know, is like an hour west of here. And I was doing this internship with Pastor Jason, who's a pastor in Franklin, Vermont. He's been there for over a decade. And he had me do everything from preaching the sermons to going to nursing homes and doing services to helping with funerals, doing hospital visits, to helping counsel people, everything that a pastor does. And so in the middle of that internship, I was really praying and thinking, you know, God, I really enjoy being a pastor in Vermont. I mean, I wasn't a pastor, but I was doing pastor's work. I really enjoy living this pastor's life in Vermont. And so I talked with Jason about that, and Jason said, well, wouldn't you know, there's a church that's looking for a new minister in a place called Derby. I think you should apply there. So in 2014, I applied. Now, I was 22, and I didn't meet quite a few of the requirements, so it was a long shot. And I kind of knew in my spirit that it probably wasn't going to work out, but I still got my hopes up, right? You still get your hopes up for stuff like that. Even when you know, like, it's kind of a long shot. So long story short, it didn't work out in 2014, and for very good reason. And in hindsight, I'm really glad that I didn't become the pastor then. But in the moment, I felt like, really? I thought this is what I wanted, and I thought this is what you wanted, God. So then, what he did was take me on a detour. Now, I thought the door was shut to coming here, right? I was like, okay, that's in the history. I moved on rather quickly, pretty resilient, and I just went to a different church down in Mass and became a youth pastor there, and it was really good. That was a detour that God was taking me on. Now, I didn't exactly know I was on the detour, but I felt like I had missed something, like I'd missed my calling, or why didn't it work out at that church? And what God did was take me on a detour to this other church, and it was an amazing experience for a couple of years. 2014 through 2016, I was with this church in Massachusetts, working right alongside the pastor, getting tons of ministry experience, learning about leadership, learning about myself, learning about my strengths and my weaknesses. And so then after two and a half years of being there, I got a phone call from a fellow who knew that this church needed a pastor. And I was like, you know, I applied there a few years ago. And he's like, yeah, they want you to apply again. And I was like, okay, and I started to see what God was doing, right? I started to see how God was leading me here. Because I tried once, it didn't work out for good reason. And then now God's orchestrating the detour to circle back to this church. And I'm really glad he took me on that detour, because say in 2014 I became the pastor here, maybe I wasn't prepared nearly as well as I am now. Maybe I flopped. Maybe I would have been a failure. Maybe it wouldn't have gone well for the church. I don't know. But God knew something, and he knew that I shouldn't come here in 2014 just yet. So he was going to bring me here in 2016 instead. So I applied again, and it went really well, and it worked out, and now I'm here. And I'm glad. I'm glad. And in hindsight, that's good, Duncan. Thank you. And I'm glad in hindsight that it didn't work out the way that I wanted it to, because that detour was actually a shortcut in many ways, I think. If I had come here when I wanted to come here in 2014, it could have gone horribly, and that could have been a whole detour in itself where I wasn't prepared and it didn't go well and things messed up, and that could have been a much longer detour. But God was going to take me on a shorter detour that was actually a shortcut to learning a lot about myself. It was a shortcut to learning a lot about ministry. It was a shortcut to being prepared, and it was a shortcut to trusting God. Because sometimes when God takes us on those detours, even though we see them as a detour, they're a shortcut for us because they force us to rely on God. Those detours force us straight to the arms of God, to trust in him, to pray to him. And that's what this sermon is about today. How from God's perspective, detours can actually be shortcuts. Well, I want to talk with you about this throughout the sermon. We are in Exodus chapter 13. We're just going to look at 2 verses today. I've been looking at whole chapters with you, and that's a lot to cover. And today I want to take a little break from doing that and just look at a couple verses. There's a group of people that we've gotten to know pretty well called the Israelites. They're traveling away from Egypt. God has set them free from Egypt where they were slaves. And so now these free men and women are leaving Egypt to go to a place called Sinai. But God's going to take the Israelites on a detour to get to Sinai. There's a much quicker route that Israel could take, but God's going to take them like 100 miles out of the way to getting to where they need to go. So here's what's happening. In chapter 13, we're looking at verses 17 and 18. If you want to follow along in the Bible, that's great. If you want to listen, that's great too. Verse 17 and 18 says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle." So we've seen that they're set free. And there's this much shorter route. And even though they didn't have GPS or maps or whatever, Israel knew that the shortest way was the direct way, straight through the Philistine country to get to Mount Sinai. They knew that that was the best way to go. But God knew something else. God knew that the Philistines were like the Egyptians. The Philistines were a wicked, evil nation that just wanted to conquer every land nearby. And so if you get 1 million or more Israelites and they come to the border of the Philistine country and they say, hey, do you mind if we pass through so we can go beyond where you live to build our own empire just outside of where your country is? Do you think the Philistines are too happy with that? No. They're thinking, we're not going to let these people take some of our land away. We want to conquer the land that they're going to. We don't want Israel to travel through here. We're not going to give them an easy time. And later on in the Bible, the Philistines and these other nations surrounding the Philistines pose problems for Israel. So God saw the big picture, whereas the Israelites, as we'll see going forward on this journey, are having a hard time trusting God. Because they're saying, pretty sure I know a quicker way to get to where we're going. They're all on foot, by the way. I don't really feel like walking hundreds of miles out of the way to get where we're going. And they go to Moses, actually, and say, in 14, Moses, are you sure God has this under control? Are you sure he got it right? And they start to doubt and think, you know what? It might have even been better if we never left Egypt at all. All because God's taken them on this little detour. People are so fickle, right? When we see Israel on this detour, they start to question everything about God. They start to question every little thing about him. They have some real trust issues. Even though God's saying, well, I'm doing you a huge favor, because if you were to go through the Philistine country, they could declare war on you and chase you right back to Egypt, where you would serve as miserable slaves for hundreds of more years. In God's perspective, the detour is actually a shortcut to something much better. Whereas if they took the shortcut, that's a detour to something much worse, what they already had in Egypt, slavery. So we have two things going on. We have man's perspective, and we have God's perspective. So God knew it wasn't a good idea, so instead of taking Israel through the country of the Philistines, he takes them around. And here's where the rubber meets the road. How would the Israelites deal with the detour? Would they be okay with it? Would they be frustrated that God had them walk hundreds more miles to get to where they're going? Would they trust God? This is what detours force us to do. They force us to wrestle with whether we trust God or not. You know, if we only ever get to take shortcuts in life, that's easy. That doesn't force us to go to God. That doesn't force us to trust God. That doesn't force us to wrestle with whether we want to follow God or not. But when we get on the detours, when the road gets tough, that's when it actually becomes a shortcut that takes us right to God. When God puts us on a detour, that forces us to go straight to God to wrestle with him about these things, about this trust, about whether we can actually have faith in him or not. Detours, yes, they're annoying and frustrating, but as I shared just at the beginning of the sermon, coming here in 2014 and then taking a detour and then coming back, that detour taught me so much more than I could have ever imagined. You know, I think a lot about my family when I think about detours, and someone that I've spent a bit of time in my family lately who's on a detour is my Uncle Rick. My Uncle Rick is a mechanic at a Chrysler dealership down in Massachusetts, and he's on a major detour. And I kind of have a first row seat to see him as he deals with this detour and to see his life as God is putting his life together while he's on this detour. So he's a mechanic at a Chrysler dealership, and for years and years and years, he's just gone to work, done his repairs, and gotten paid well, and gone home. You know how it works is there's 5 mechanics that he works with. If 5 cars come in, 1 car goes to each mechanic, right? It's just simple math. If 4 cars come in, 4 of the mechanics get a car and 1 doesn't. So the next day, if the first car that comes in goes to that 5th mechanic who didn't get work the day before. It's just simple math. It's just ethical business, right? Well, a few years ago, a new manager came in to the dealership, and he was good friends with a couple of the mechanics, and for some reason he didn't like my Uncle Rick. So how it would work is if one day 3 cars came in, the manager's 3 good friends would get work, and my Uncle Rick and the other guy wouldn't. And then the next day, if only 3 cars came in, the 3 of his friends would get work, and my Uncle Rick wouldn't. Or he also gets paid kind of on commission, like if you work for 6 hours on a car, it's like $18 per hour, and he gets a chunk of that money. So if you're a mechanic at a dealership, you want the harder, more difficult jobs because it means you're working on those cars for a longer amount of hours, and you get paid more from that. But again, this manager would give my uncle the oil changes, and he would give the other guys the engine repairs, things like that. So my uncle's in this detour, and he's near retirement age. He's like late 50s. He's just got a few years to go before he retires, and he's stuck at a crossroads thinking, why is this happening all of a sudden? My last few years of working, 40 hours a week full-time, why is this new manager coming in now? And so my uncle's on this detour, and he had to make some quick and hard decisions, and he's been miserable working there for a few years. Well, he finally made this decision to leave that job and build a garage in his backyard. And it's a huge step of faith, right? Because he's on this detour, and he's thinking, well, I could be comfortable and keep this job that I'm miserable in, or I could take a huge step of faith and build a garage in my backyard and see how it goes. So he did that. And now that detour at his work led him to something much better. And he had to take that step of faith and say, God, okay, I'm going to try this out. I'm going to build this garage. And now he's loving it. He can work his own hours. He gets paid what he wants to get paid, right? He doesn't have a manager. And he's helping people in the community that need repair work, that can't afford to go to the mechanic. So it's a win-win all the way around. But that detour in his life forced him to make a tough decision. Will I take this direction, or will I stay on this road? Will I follow where God's leading me to build this garage, or will I stay miserable in this work with this manager that's treating me poorly? The Israelites have to face something different, right? Because they had a horrible manager, the Pharaoh. And they had to say, are we going to go back to Egypt and work for that horrible manager again? Or are we going to trust where God's leading us? And while they're on the detour, they actually start to think, maybe we should go back to that horrible manager. Maybe that would be better. If my Uncle Rick could talk with the Israelites, he would tell them, no. Follow the detour. Don't go back to the horrible manager. Don't go back to Pharaoh. But this is kind of what we humans do, right? We start to doubt God. We start to think, maybe I have a better plan than what God does. I would like to argue that God knows a little bit better than we do. And we will see it play out for the Israelites, but they would continue to wrestle with God, and they would continue to fight against God and God's plans. As you're listening to the story of my Uncle Rick, were any of you reminded of your own life at all, maybe sometime when you were in your career or currently in your career, and you start to take a detour? Like maybe you were hoping to get a certain job, and it didn't play out. Or maybe someone new was hired where you were working, and you're now having to deal with that person. Or maybe you even got laid off from work. Maybe you were hoping to get a job, like I was hoping to get the job here in 2014, and it didn't play out. And so now you don't have the job you wanted, and you're on this detour. Or maybe even a lot of you are retired, and you have big hopes and dreams for retirement, but now you're kind of looking back to when you were working full-time, and you kind of wish you had your career again. Or maybe you're in retirement, and you found that you're struggling financially. I don't know what detours you have been on or what detours you're currently on, but what I can say with confidence is that God knows the detours that you're on, and He has a purpose for that. And He's going to use that as a shortcut to drive you straight to Him. Because a lot of times when God puts us on a detour, it forces us straight into His hands. It forces us straight into wrestling with whether we trust Him or not. It forces us to grow. It forces us to wrestle with the difficult questions of life. These detours are shortcuts, in my opinion, straight to God. The good thing is, even though we don't see exactly where detours are taking us, God sees the full picture. He saw that for the Israelites, and He sees that in our life. The question that I have is, what will you do when you're on a detour in life? When you're on a detour, maybe some of you are on a detour right now, what are you going to do with that? I could stand up here and conclude my sermon by saying, just simply trust God, and it'll all go well for you. And you would all leave here and say, well, Pastor, we've already heard that millions of times before. That wasn't helpful. And you would be honest, right? Because I think most all of us know the simple answer. Just trust God, and it's going to be okay. But we have a lot to learn, actually, from the Israelites and how they dealt with God. For instance, do you all know what the word Israel means? Or where that name came from? Some of you probably do. Many of us probably don't. I didn't know this till recently. In the book of Genesis, which is the book just before Exodus, there's a man named Jacob. And Jacob was a character more like me and a lot of us who didn't just go with what God was telling him. He didn't just say, yes, sir, I'll do that. No. Jacob was a wrestler. And so at one point, God sends an angel of the Lord, to actually wrestle with Jacob, to change Jacob's direction. Jacob wanted to go this way, and God sent an angel to literally wrestle with the man, Jacob, to change the course of his life. And so God renames Jacob after this incident. He renames Jacob to Israel. He starts calling Jacob Israel. And the name Israel means he wrestles with God. He wrestles with God. Like every baby name has a meaning, right? He wrestles with God. That's Jacob's new name. He wrestles with God. And God calls the whole nation of his people Israel. Because what were they good at? Wrestling with God. Isn't it funny that God would name his whole people group, he wrestles with God? But it's so true of how we relate to God, if we're being honest. God names them for what they were good at. And guess what? We're good at it too. When I was talking with the kids, about, the common question you get every day, how are you doing today? Well, I'm good. That might be truth mixed with a lot of facade, or like you're pretending. Because that's how we like to do it, right? We like the simple answers, like just trust God and all will be good. Just go from here trusting God and it'll all turn out okay for you. But the truth is, we actually probably have some wrestling to do with God. We don't want to just put on that pretend, like it's all good, I'm just going to trust God, it's going to be good. Because a lot of us actually have a hard time trusting God, especially in the detours of our life, right? So I would like to propose a different conclusion to this sermon. None of us are perfect at trusting God. If any of us were perfect at trusting God, we would never have anxiety, we would never worry, we would never fear anything, and we'd probably never have many problems in life. Because when you perfectly trust God, you don't have any of those things. But I would guess that many of us worry, many of us fear, many of us have anxiety, right? I have that. And so we have a hard time trusting God. So instead of just the simple answer of just trust God, it'll be all right, no, I'm going to encourage you to actually wrestle with God a little bit. If you're having a hard time with God, don't pretend it's all good. Because God can already see that it's not all good. When you're on that detour, right, it is a shortcut straight to God. Wrestle with him a little bit, like Israel. Say, God, I'm having a hard time trusting you. Or, God, I'm doubting that this detour is going to do anything good for my life. Or, God, I've been put in this situation that I didn't want. I'm not happy with that. And wrestle with God a little bit, because when you begin to be honest with God, then he can really begin to work in your heart. He can really begin to grow that trust in you. But if when you're on the detour, all you ever put on is this facade and you pretend, yeah, God, everything's good. I'm going to keep trusting you. Yep, going to do it. It's going to be good. God can't work in that because it's just dishonest. God literally names his people a group of wrestlers. They wrestle with God. We're not too different today. It's true that in the detours in our life, they're not fun, but they are shortcuts that lead us straight to God. And if you're on a detour right now, whatever it is, whether it's with work, dealing with your kids, with your spouse, with friends at church, whatever it is, wherever this detour is, wherever this crossroads has hit you, I would encourage you, don't just put on this facade like everything's good. Because you're probably worried. You're probably feeling anxious. You're probably nervous about how it's going to play out. Simply go to God and wrestle with him through these things. He's not going to rebuke you for that. Don't be like rude towards God, right? But just be honest with him. Work through it with him, just like we'll see Israel wrestle with God at every point along their journey. And God will teach us through that. Amen? I want to pray for us as we turn to God for help in our detours, because I know it's not easy. Sometimes it's a daily thing for us. Sometimes it's more frequent than we'd like, and I'm willing to bet a lot of you are in some sort of detour right now, and I want to pray for you.